This is Michelle Lim, the Senior Lecturer at Macquarie Law School, talking about implementation and accountability. Over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for acknowledging country as well. And to everyone who has acknowledged country, I'm speaking to you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Wadamadugal clan of the Darug Nation. So I've been asked today to talk about the governance and accountability components. Given the time, I'll talk about the bit that I work on, that is the legal bit, because that underpins the effectiveness or otherwise of the governance and accountability frameworks. So I'll start by talking a bit about the history of the convention itself and what that potentially means for how we move the convention forward from an instrument of aspiration to one of action. And so I'll end by talking about the changes required in the convention and how we learn from the target-based approach adopted by the convention since 2000. But first, let's go into history and look at the 3 decades of the convention. Alison highlighted very nicely yesterday that it was born in 1992. It has almost universal membership. There is a significant country that is not a party to the convention, and I'll let you think about who that is as a hint. It's that country that likes to tell other countries what to do, but then will step out at the last minute, even though they have been quite involved, as many of you will know, with the GBF negotiations. So, as James has highlighted, as Emily did as well, importantly, what this convention does is it moves from that species-based approach we heard yesterday about the ecosystem goal, this entrenched in the conceptualization of the convention itself. In many ways, a very good convention, looking holistically, and we've heard Laura talking about integration, looking holistically about the range of ways in which nature is so important, not only in its own right, not only because of what it does for us, but also the really important relationships that Chrissy alluded to yesterday between humans and nature. And the objectives, again, I won't walk through each of them. Alison did that really nicely yesterday, but just to highlight that the objectives of the convention reflect an important compromise between developed and developing countries in relation to the range of ways in which we value nature. And then to getting into the nitty-gritty of the law, the content itself is really good. It's got these range of different ways in which the convention anticipates and includes ways in which we can conserve nature, both in situ, that is protected areas, but also ex situ, zoos and seed banks, etc., detailed legal provisions in Article 8 and 9 around rehabilitation, restoration, but also the importance of conservation beyond protected areas. And worked into the convention text is also all those implementation issues on the integration across national policy and legal frameworks. And again, that mainstreaming and integration across the range of sectors that John alluded to at the start, that mainstreaming has been part of the convention in its legal text since the very beginning. So on its face, a really, really good biodiversity convention, right? But, and this is a really, really big qualification, that is that almost every single provision of the convention is qualified in terms of as far as possible and as appropriate, subject to national legislation, in accordance with the particular capabilities of a particular country, including Article 3, reaffirming the sovereign right over biological resources. The end result being that Article 26, that is self-reporting under the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, being the only actually binding provision of the convention. And some of you might ask, well, does it matter if it's binding or not? And we'll get into that conversation in a little bit when we talk about whether this is indeed a Paris Agreement for biodiversity. Perhaps the lack of actual binding commitments under the convention reflects the true intention of the parties. Writing in 1997, Karl Rastiala highlighted that country that I said wasn't a signatory, the United States. George Bush Sr. didn't sign the convention, even though the US had been very much involved in its negotiation, citing the threat to American jobs due to intellectual property and environmental provisions being contrary to America's pharmaceutical interests. John Major of the UK, in contrast, and I think this in many ways reflects countries' attitude to the convention, happily signed the convention, citing it as an attractive, easily implemented green gesture. And so Harrett and Pritchard, writing at the release of the Aichi targets, stated that the end result is of the multiple get out of jail clauses is a convention where countries agree only that biodiversity conservation requires some form of global response. In other words, how non-binding can you be and still be called a convention? The CBD in some ways is an example of this. And we see from 2000 onwards this move towards a target-based approach. And what's interesting here is how the lessons that have been learned from 2010 towards the Aichi targets provide hope in terms of what is already being seen in the draft and what could be achieved in the post-2020 targets. Some of you will be well aware that the 2010 biodiversity target was this broad statement of achieving by 2010 a significant reduction of current rate of biodiversity loss at global, regional, national level, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, that is so broad that it will come as no surprise that the countries then spent most of the time between 2002 and 2010 working out well, what exactly are we doing here? And it was good to see that in the Aichi targets, the fact that states have learnt those lessons, then getting into that much more level of detail in the 20 Aichi targets. So, and we heard from James yesterday, really astute observation about how states have again learnt from Aichi targets in terms of the not conflating actions and outcomes under the post-2020 targets. But one of the legal questions here is whether this is a Paris Agreement for biodiversity. All of you that's been following the post-2020 framework discussion in the news would be forgiven for thinking that, yes, it is a Paris type plan. This is the UK Guardian, the same author again, talking about a Paris style UN agreement. Australian Australian Guardian talking about Nature's Paris Plan, again in the form of an agreement, and the Straits Times following the adoption of the Kunming Declaration. We're hearing that same language of an agreement which has been compared to Paris. And this ABC report, which both James and I were interviewed for, again talking about this Paris Agreement for nature, which begs the question, is it a Paris Agreement for biodiversity? No, it's not. And again, journalists have asked me, well, yes, you lawyer, words, but what is the matter? Or in other words, why does it matter? It matters because it allows governments to claim that they are obligations and binding commitments towards a post-2020 framework when there is none there. So we see a very different road to Paris compared to that to Kunming in terms of the Paris Agreement was the explicit result of wanting to conclude a successor instrument to the Kyoto Protocol. Protocol, the language obviously being of a binding nature. And so you get the text of agreement being this hybrid binding, non-binding agreement in Paris, but states are legally bound under Paris to report on their nationally determined contributions, as well as the associated architecture around monitoring, around reporting, etc. There's been limited discussion of the legal nature of Kunming outcomes there, and I will come to this in a little bit, how there has been discussion around what the accountability and monitoring will look like, but ultimately there needs to be so much more emphasis on what states are committing to here, in addition to, yes, the good work that's been done around the targets themselves. So thinking about the issues of extinction that James highlighted yesterday, the lack of ambition around just stemming the rate of extinction, thinking about issues of integration, thinking about the impacts of climate change that Mark just talked about earlier, it comes to a point for the convention that so much more is needed than a set of non-binding commitments. There's this need to move beyond the platitudes of the convention, and transformative change is language that has been used in the discussion of the text, but transformation that understands the interdependence of human and nature, the interdependence of resilient ecosystems and thriving human societies, that humans and nature are intrinsically interconnected, and importantly, that Indigenous peoples and local communities need to play that central role as part of the convention. The IPBES Global Assessment, for example, found that lands conserved by Indigenous and local communities have significantly greater biodiversity outcomes than other lands, and yet land rights and other means by which these communities can continue to sustain land are limited. Importantly, this issue of integration comes up again, that current regulation is limited. The Convention Secretariat has, of course, done a lot to address this, but also the need to take into account the hyper-connected nature of the drivers of biodiversity loss. So how do we learn more from the lessons of ACIUCN? The effective use of targets can enhance the credibility of agreements. Effective goal setting is useful. I'm not saying here, look, unless they're binding, forget about the post-2020 framework, it's not going to do anything. I'm not saying that. But what it does create this collective plan for the rest, for countries to come together. But importantly, if we are to get to a place that's very different to the 2020 at the end of ACIUCN, there needs to be a lot more thought put into the accountability mechanisms and the built-in reporting processes. And I was fortunate to be able to put this question to Elizabeth Mrema, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you as the Executive Secretary of the Convention, delivered the annual lecture at our Centre of Environmental Law a couple of weeks ago. And she highlighted that as part of the post-2020 framework, it's a package deal. It's not just the targets, it's also the monitoring and accountability mechanisms, as well as capacity building, resource mobilization, and the gender action plan. And it's really good to see that the national biodiversity strategies and action plans are a key focus, as this is, as I said earlier, the only binding component of the convention. So that's all really good. At the same time, you see from the Kunming Declaration, point number 1, ensuring the development, adoption, and implementation of the post-2020 framework, but also around monitoring, reporting, and review. So in some ways, the countries are making all the right noises, I suppose, but at the same time, I think it's worth remembering what is at stake here. We don't want to get to 2030 and we're in the same place or worse for biodiversity. And to echo the words of Harriet and Pritchard, writing at the start of the ACIUCN targets, we risk, if states do not commit to more binding obligations, or even in a lesser form, a greater accountability mechanism, that failure may result not from the technical issues, but the unwillingness of member states to back targets with obligations. So in other words, my message to those of you involved in the negotiations and everyone here that helps hold countries' feet to the fire, your planet needs you. Thank you.